So, good morning and welcome to you all. Thank you very much to everyone who's joining us here in the room at the European Parliament in Brussels and to everybody joining us online via the live stream. It's really great to have everybody with us for this important discussion on better decision-making for better outcomes, harnessing the power of real-world evidence. My name is Sue Saville. I'm an independent medical and health journalist, and I'm delighted to be guiding this session today, which is part of the European Health Tech Summit, and it brings an important dimension to the debate around establishing a European health data space, and of course in the context of the upcoming revision of the EU pharmaceutical legislation. Because if decisions on policy, on treatment, on payment have to be put together to understand their impact on patients, on health systems, those decisions need to be based on information, on data, on actually what's going on in the world, not just from controlled clinical trials, but how these things affect our daily lives in the real world. So analysis of this data from the real world, RWD, real world data, then forms real-world evidence, RWE. I think we'll be hearing a lot of that today. And it can create a more holistic understanding of the entire health ecosystem. The European Commission, who we're delighted to have represented with us here today, have said in the past that the most intensive use of real-world evidence in health policy making could yield additional savings. And that, of course, is a significant consideration for healthcare systems, for budgets in Europe and indeed worldwide. And the key to unlocking the potential of real-world evidence is collaboration. And that's why we've got together today, all of you here, people online. We have policymakers, we have politicians, we have patients, we have clinicians, academics, and more, all to discuss real-world evidence with reference to three key conditions. We're going to consider influenza, rare diseases, and oncology, cancer. And the speakers will urge you to take a look at their call to action. This is being launched today, and as a journalist, we love exclusives, so this is a first. You'll see around the room a few QR codes. There's one on the door as you go out. Do scan those QR codes and read the 4 key recommendations. These form a plank to lay down an evidence-based consensus statement on the importance of real-world evidence in decision-making and policy-making. So if you can support that, circulate it on your social media or any other information you get today, put it out there, tell the world, and if you'd like more information about the call to action, you can get in touch with the organisers on that. You can spread the word about anything that's happening today. This is not secret. We want to get the information out there globally even. And you have a chance today to network. So although we'll be finishing around 11 a.m., you will be invited to an early lunch. You'll have earned it. We're taking no coffee breaks. So do join us for some refreshments on the 3rd floor. Take the lift, take the stairs. This is a health summit after all. And that's on the 3rd floor, just a few floors down. So do join us from that. So we're very honoured to be here at the European Parliament. We are guests of our host here, and I'm delighted to be sitting next to MEP Stelios Kimbouropoulos, who's been very active in the issue of the digitalisation of healthcare, especially around real-world evidence and what that evidence, that data can bring to healthcare. So MEP, thank you so much for hosting us. And tell us for your opening remarks, set the scene. Why is this topic so important, please?
Thank you very much, Sue. Really, I'm very, very excited and somehow very annoying because this event is coming to an end. 3 days conference. We have heard a lot of issues, different aspects, and different ideas of how we can bring together all that we have discussed during these days. And I totally agree with you that the most valuable outcome that we can take with us after the end of this conference is collaboration. And is something that we are discussing a lot. We try to say it on the corridors, but sometimes at the end of the discussion is not coming, because we have, unfortunately, our ears strictly closed, and I think that I believe that after this meeting and after this conference, we had the chance to slightly open our very closed ears. And saying these few words, thank you very much once again. One more meeting, one more morning that you are here, dear colleagues, dear friends, dear guests, and I welcome you to this last panel of discussion for the European Health Tech Summit, which, as you know, it's the first time that something like this took place in the Parliament. All panel discussions were dedicated to the role of digital technology in the health sector. Today's panel discussion focused on harnessing the potential of real-world data, evidence, and data for better health outcomes. I'm honored to host this event organized with the support of CSL Securities and which concludes the European Health Tech Summit. As we continue to face challenges in our healthcare systems, it is more important than ever to explore how data and digital technologies can improve patient care. Real-world evidence can provide valuable insights into how treatments perform in the real world beyond the controlled setting of clinical trials. The use of RWE can help us make more informed decisions about the safety and effectiveness of treatments and ultimately improve patient outcomes, and this is what we want for this series. The discussion is very timely as the work on the European Health Data Space regulation progresses in the European Parliament, and my colleague, Mr. Tomislav, who will be here in a few minutes, he is going to inform us as a rapporteur on the file and with the European Commission about to publish the proposal for the long-awaited, and I'm afraid maybe even longer, and I'm referring to the revision of pharma legislation. We now have the opportunity to set the stage for the next decades and create a Europe that fully realizes the potential of health data and remains at the forefront of health innovation. Today, we have brought together leading policymakers, patients, and experts to discuss how real-world evidence can benefit policy and regulatory decision-making across 3 disease areas: rare diseases, influenza, and oncology. But this is only the start, and we can develop other areas of health sector that they can use real-world evidence. The event also coincides with the launch of a call to action, and please give special attention on this, which emphasizes the importance of using real-world evidence in healthcare decision-making. So, I invite you to support the call to action and join in me advocating for more holistic approach to data for better policies and healthier EU citizens. Thank you very, very much for your participation, and I wish you a really very fruitful discussion.
Thank you, Stelios, if I may get familiar today. That's a very helpful overview and introduction. Thank you very much indeed. And yes, MEP Tomislav Sokol, as if on cue, arrives on the scene with the most perfect timing. Welcome, and come and join us. Take a seat over here. Your colleague Stelios has just given a lovely introduction to why we're all here. Take a deep breath. We have with us our host is Stelios, but we are very delighted to have MEP Tomislav Sokol, who is the rapporteur of the European Health Data Space on the ENVI Committee, and very familiar then with the benefits of real-world evidence in health legislation. So, if you've got your breath, if I may, straight into it. What would you say then are the main benefits that the European health data space could bring when it comes to improving the use and uptake of real-world evidence when we're assessing, developing, and then assessing new medicines?
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here. I would like to first, of course, thank Stelios for inviting me to speak on, I think, very important topic. I was in a queue because of the council meeting. This is why I was a bit late, but I think I was just on time. Okay. So thank you very much. Yes, so real-world evidence is definitely a big topic, and I think we will hear a lot about all the benefits of real-world data. I will just mention, for instance, for rare disease patients. I think that's probably the category of patients which can benefit the most from real-world data, especially since in many cases you cannot conduct phase 3 clinical trials because you don't have enough patients. So definitely for development of new medicines and the treatments, this is something which is very important. Also what I think what the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us, and Stelios and I are both in the COVID committee, is also important of real-world data for policy making. And because I know that we saw, for instance, that different methodologies, how data is gathered from different member states, for instance, on the number of deaths, causes of deaths, whether it was from COVID or with COVID and things like that. So we had different methodologies, different ways of gathering the data, different protocols in different member states, which means the data was often incomparable. And this is which is definitely a problem. And these are the issues which the health data space wants and needs to resolve. When you speak of the European health data space, so what is the idea? So the idea is that we make it possible for data in European Union to be exchanged, to be used, to be interoperable for 2 main purposes. So first is the so-called primary use of data. That means for patients themselves directly with their healthcare professionals. So for instance, if you are traveling in another member state, you have an accident, or you are sick, or maybe you have some kind of a chronic condition which needs treatment, you can go to the medical professional in that member state, and this medical professional can have access to your electronic health record, which will be established on European level. We are prescribing which which data, which information needs to be at least in this electronic health record, and then this medical professional can prescribe you treatment much faster, much more efficiently. And because they will have all your medical information much faster than before, and they can give you treatment much faster than it is now. What is very important is that we have this common European system, common European health record, and that data can be used, can be interoperable, can be exchanged between different member states. Now, this is obviously a problem. This is something that doesn't work sometimes within individual member states, like federal states, where you have divisions of competences between the regional level and the national level. You have a problem of interoperability of data between those regions of the same member state. So the idea is to change that. Of course, we are not formally harmonizing everything because healthcare systems belong to national competence, but we believe that we will have the so-called spillover effect. So which means if all your data needs to be in digital form, if you have European electronic exchange format prescribed with all the data there, of course this also applies within the territory of the member states. So the whole idea is that for primary use of data for treatment of patients, we will have this data digitalized. We will have minimum data which is prescribed, which needs to be part of this electronic health record, and then this is something which will be useful and could be exchanged both within member states and outside of the member states. This is for the individual patients for so-called primary use, but I think when you speak of real-world evidence, the so-called secondary use is even more important. So secondary use is the use for other purposes, like especially research and development. So research and development of new technologies, and the whole idea is that we are prescribing the purposes for which data can be used. And if there is either a university or a company which wants to undertake some research or to develop certain product or something, they will send a request to health data access bodies, which will be set up in every member state. Explain the purpose for which they need the data, and then the health data access bodies, if they fulfill the requirements, will give them access in a secured environment to anonymize the aggregated data of all the patients. And so the idea is that we will have much bigger amount of data available for research and development through this system than we have now. So this is the whole idea. What we want is to actually stimulate research and development and investments within the European Union instead of what we have now, that it is focused mostly in the US or China, etc., where it's much easier to get big amounts of data, metadata, aggregated data, etc. So this is the main point. This is, I think, a real game changer. This is one of those few pieces of EU legislation which actually creates a difference, which can really make a big difference when compared to the current situation. The main political discussions will be about the role of the patients, because for the secondary use of data, because in the Commission proposal there was nothing prescribed on the patient's role in this, so whether patients can get out of the system, whether they need to give consent, etc., which means that essentially they had no saying in that. We are changing this. In my first draft report, I proposed the so-called opt-out mechanism, so that patients who don't want to be part of the system for any reason can opt out. But this is as far as we are willing to go, because the experience shows us that if we go for an opt-in system or a consent-based system, that we will just not have enough people being part of the system. We will not have enough data that it can be useful. And if you want real-world evidence, one of the most important things is to have these big amounts of data that we need. So if you don't have enough data, if it's not representative, then the whole thing is pointless. So what is important for us that this opt-out mechanism is kept during political negotiations, even though I know some political groups don't want opt-in or consent, etc. But I think if we want the system to work, if we want to have enough data that it can really be useful, real-world data, then opt-out system is, I think, the best way to go. And just one last point. So the deadline for amendments is at 10 a.m. today, half an hour, which means I have to leave now because I have to table some amendments on my own report that I couldn't put in the first version because it's a joint report with the other committee. We will start negotiations very soon. The idea is to have negotiations in the Parliament finished by by summer to start the trialogue with the Council in September and hopefully finish the whole file by the end of this year. It is ambitious, but if we don't do it by the end of this year, then we will not probably be able to finish before elections, which means that then we have new parliament, new commission, everything will be postponed for years. So it's important that we get this right and we get this fast.
Well, thank you very much indeed, MEP Tomislav Sokol. Thank you very much for setting the scene. You better run away then as swiftly as you arrived here to go and make those important amendments to this very significant legislation. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you. So we're going to consider, as Stelios was saying, then three main areas. And I thought it was a really important point there that it's not just these three areas that real-world evidence is going to be important for, of course, but the whole health ecosystem. We're going to start by considering rare diseases. And I'd like to invite Dr. Alexander Natz to come up onto the stage to join us. He is the Secretary General of EUCOPE, one of those acronyms. It is the European Confederation of Pharmaceutical Entrepreneurs, representing small and medium-sized innovators in this space. So, Dr. Natz, you're going to give us a presentation on striking the right balance between scientific rigor and practicality to improve access for rare disease patients, and then I'll invite others up and we'll take this further for discussion. So, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you first of all, MEP Kimpouropoulos, for inviting me. Also, a big thank you to MEP Sokol. It's a great pleasure to be here to talk about a very important topic, which is real-world evidence. And we are starting the discussion to talk about the use of real-world evidence in rare diseases. And I think especially in that area, it is incredibly important to look at the potential. And I really like the title, Harnessing the Power of Real-World Evidence. And I think that's really what it is. So we've been coming a long way from pharmacovigilance legislation passed here in Brussels in the year, I think 2010, so 13 years ago, when we have been looking into pharmacovigilance data. So that was data generated after the approval of a medicine in order to safeguard that there is still a positive risk-benefit ratio for that individual medicine. But we have not been harnessing all the potential from that data, and this is really what we are discussing here today. Let me take you maybe 2 years back, and I think it's probably actually pretty much exactly 2 years ago when we had 3 vaccines in the COVID-19 pandemic authorized by the European Commission with the great support of the European Medicines Agency. So we had 3 options to choose from, and we all, and I think at least most of us, we were thinking like, that's great to have 3 options, but we didn't know about all the potential of those 3 medicines. And 2 of those medicines were mRNA products, technology known to researchers, but not really to the wider audience. And I think also physicians were not really familiar with, on the one hand side, the disease COVID-19, and secondly, also the potential of the technology itself, the mRNA technology. So we didn't know everything at that point in time, but we had the luxury to make choices between 3 products. And I think I think many physicians started with a non-mRNA product at that point in time, but over time, real-world evidence has shown that most of the physicians have actually been switching to the mRNA products. We have learned a lot, especially also from Israel. Do we need a second vaccination? Do we need a third vaccination? We didn't know all that at that point in time. And this is just to illustrate the power of real-world evidence. That is actually real-world evidence, which concerned us all very much at that point in time, to be able to get an option to get out of the pandemic. And I think that's really a very powerful example to talk about the potential. And I'm sure you will do that in the second panel. So I don't want to talk about the influenza part of the real-world evidence discussion here in all the detail. But I just wanted to kick it off with a concrete example. I think when we look at rare diseases, it's one of those areas where, similar to the situation with the COVID-19 influenza, we don't know very much about all those diseases. I mean, it's difficult to find patients to be recruited into clinical trials. We've heard before as well that the clinical trials are often very small, especially in ultra-rare diseases. So it is really important to make sure that when the product is rolled out to the market, is approved, that we are watching very carefully, not just how the product is performing in terms of quality, safety, and efficacy, but how good is it does it work in patient subpopulation A? Does it work in B? And how is it performing? And I think that is where really there is a great potential of real-world evidence, especially in the area of rare diseases. I think we have great opportunities here to really see the potential and harness the potential of real-world evidence. And let me start first of all with the first thing I see where we can use real-world evidence is filling in for clearly identified data gaps. And these data gaps very often exist for the payers, because the payers very often can make choices in even some rare disease areas. If you look at the CAR T cells in oncology, if we look in spinal muscular atrophy, SMA, where we have 3 treatment options, I think in the CAR T cells we even have more than 3. So it's about making choices. What product is the best for which patient group? And very often what is lacking in rare diseases are direct comparisons, because it is so difficult to bring those patients into clinical trials at that early stage. So what we should do is identify data gaps, and we should carefully listen to the payers to say, well, this is where we need data, defining that gap, and then filling that gap over the next 2 or 3 years, answering clearly identified questions, and not just going on a fishing expedition to say, well, I have some data here, I have some data there, does that help you? No, when we are talking about real-world evidence, it's really to be used in reimbursement decision-making processes. It's also about clearly defined gaps of data, but rather than saying no to reimbursement of that medicine, it's about saying yes and closing those data gaps over time. I think that's the way forward, and I think that's my most important point here in terms of harnessing the potential of real-world evidence. The second point is really also real-world evidence is a great source for information for patients and physicians. I mean, that example of the COVID-19 vaccines has already shown that we didn't know everything, and it has helped a lot to inform patients and physicians what choices to be made if you have more than one option. And the third option is really, it's a bit more on the technical side, but we're talking more and more about outcome-based agreements, where the company is actually saying, I'm giving a guarantee for my medicine that it's going to work for the next 3, 4, 5 years, so that certain incidents are not occurring, certain hospital codes are not coded. It can be very technical, but it's about giving guarantees that the product is performing. And I think for that, what you need, and it's very much about data protection rights and data privacy as well, but what you need is the data of the individual patient to tick the box whether there's performance or whether there's non-performance. So also in that element, there can be a lot of potential for real-world evidence. If we go to the next slide. Yeah, I think we've seen it in pharmacovigilance. We've seen that real-world evidence can close those data gaps in that area. I think I have already alluded to that. It can speed up the process for therapies to reach the market. I think that's also very important. And if we go to the next slide, we have really a lot to learn about the long-term clinical outcomes, about the impact on patients' quality of life. So it's very much really about the patient to be informed about how good the product is. And this is, especially in rare diseases, this is when we are learning about the potential of a medicine, how good the medicine is. And the last point is about cost benefit and financial implications of that medicine. Also, payers, of course, have an interest to see, is it worth the money I'm spending for the product the physicians are choosing for individual patients. So if we go to the next slide, I think I'm about to finish on the next slide after that. I think real-world evidence really unlocks a great potential for innovative payment models. I think there is actually, and that's on the next slide, I think a lot we can do or a lot we can draw experiences from registries, which we've seen. EBMT is one registry I'd like to highlight here, which is about stem cell transplantation, which includes also CAR T cells. Partly, if I understand correctly, it's a European, if not a global registry. So it's a very good example that we can take it up to the higher level. That is not always national, because if we always do that at the national level, we have problems really not to overburden companies. Really, if you imagine we have one EU HTA system, but 27 registry requests, or even 28, one from EMA and 27 from the national reimbursement institutions. that's too much also for especially for smaller companies which we are representing to take on board at the beginning of bringing products to the market. So let's make sure we're harmonizing. Let's make sure we're reusing data. We've heard from MEP Sokol that the European health data space is a great potential in that respect, that we are having interoperability of data sets. And let me give you one example here. We can go to the next slide, I think. Let me give you one example from Germany, where the European Medicines Agency has been asking for registry data for a post-authorization safety study, and that data has been reused for a pay-for-performance model offered to the German payers in beta thalassemia for gene therapy. So that's really what we need, that we reuse the data for different purposes. If we have one set of registry data requested from the European Medicines Agency, that we can reuse it for payer purposes. We have been actually helping to set up and be part of a multi-stakeholder group, real-world evidence for decision, which has been, in my opinion, very successful really to really outline where we can use real-world evidence, how it can be used, and what the real potential is of real-world evidence. I think it's a multi-stakeholder setting. You talked about collaboration, so that's a very good example, I think, in that respect, what collaboration can do. We have people from EMA on the table. We have people from the payers, the regulators on the table, HTAs as well, so it's really important. We are also talking very much when it comes to cell and gene therapies, and I would like to also say a big thank you to the MEPs involved in the initiative Transform, where we are talking about the potential of cell and gene therapies, of one-time therapies, and especially there, it is really important to look into the future, to measure when it's a one-time therapy, to measure success, to be open for pay-for-performance models and these kind of mechanisms to convince payers to actually say yes, because in my opinion, that's all it is about. We need to make sure that we're not just getting approved medicines by the European Commission into the market. We need to make sure that we get those medicines into the reimbursement systems. And real-world evidence, especially in that space, can play an incredible role. And that gets me, I think, to my last slide here, which showcases where here in Brussels, where the European Parliament can actually make the difference. And the first thing is the EU HTA, which is already there, where we're just now talking about the right methodology. Of course, we are all clear in industry, I think, about the fact that RCT clinical trials, randomized clinical trials, are the gold standard. There's no doubt about it. We don't want to replace it, but we want to allow for data gaps which are closed later on by way of real-world evidence and identify those data gaps. So RCTs are the gold standards, but let's make sure that we factor in real-world evidence into those decision-making processes at the EU HTA level, because that's going to be crucial for getting products into reimbursement at the member state level later on. The second thing, we're waiting for the general pharmaceutical legislation for some months, weeks, whatsoever. I hear it's going to be delayed again. Anyway, it will come probably in April, and I think also there is a great potential to bring in the discussion for real-world evidence. And last but not least, we have heard MEP Sokol talking about the European health data space, the need to get this across in the term of this parliament. I think there is also great potential really to bring in the concept of real-world evidence, which benefits the needs of patients, payers, industry, and all stakeholders involved. I think that's my last slide. I would like to thank you very much for inviting me, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Alexander Natz. And to discuss some of these points, I'd like to invite to join us up here two more speakers. Christina Kyriakopoulou, who is the Senior Policy Officer at DG RTG, that's the Department for Research and Innovation at the European Commission, and also Dr. Ravi Jandiala, who's a visiting senior lecturer at the Centre for Pharmaceutical Medicine Research at King's College London and consultant pharmaceutical physician. And may I just check, Stelios, are you comfortable to stay with us throughout the discussions up here? And I know we're going to come back to you at the very end, but if you're comfortable...
The discussion is really good.
Excellent, thank you, thank you. And welcome Christina, and welcome Ravi. I'm going to stick to first names after this. Very, very helpful setting the scene there, and especially pointing out that with rare diseases, of course, they are such small populations. I think it's interesting today with the three areas that we've chosen to discuss. We have smaller populations with rare diseases. we have much larger populations for influenza, and particularly the vaccination there, and also then for oncology for cancer. So on the rare diseases, Christina, you have a particular interest in this. I would like to get right back to basics. Can you tell me, what is your understanding of real-world evidence in the context of rare diseases? What do you understand by it? What do you want to collect? Just press the little button there, that's perfect.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. So real-world evidence from what we have seen from the research, European research and innovation programs. They have, we hear this terminology lately in the literature very much upcoming, but traditionally, because of the heterogeneity of the rare diseases and because we don't know a lot of knowledge about the pathophysiology of diseases and the differences between the expressions or the symptoms of disease in different patients, traditionally, at the European, at least level, we have started to implement this European collaborative project, these networks, multidisciplinary expertise coming together back. I was making a search back from 2024. We have started creating these networks of different disciplines to be able to understand the pathophysiology of disease. So this is critical. And now I'm coming to the registries and the natural history studies. Part of understanding of the basic of knowledge of disease, which is fundamental for new drugs. If we are missing the fundamental knowledge basic, we cannot have the evidence to go for new treatments and new drugs. So real-world evidence can mean understanding the pathology and the progression of disease via natural history studies. It can mean what's happening in reality in the patients outside the clinical research development, for example, patient registries, in the real-world healthcare system, how the patient's outcomes are expressed in the real-world setting. But of course, it can mean a lot of new technologies, mobile apps, digital solutions, which are coming very promising. And I think that there is a great potential to harness all this power, particularly with artificial intelligence and machine learning methodologies, which is coming very much into the picture.
Thank you. Let's bounce that over to Ravi here. If we're just starting with definitions and what that means, particularly for the legislators who are here, to understand. You've done some work on this, some studies. Perhaps you can help the legislators, the regulators, with the definition. What's your conception of real-world evidence?
I think thank you very much for the Thank you very much for the invite. And I think the definition is always a good starting point. And we've covered some of the components here this morning. But to bring them all together, we really want to understand that evidence is binary. What might be evidence for me on a particular research question may not be evidence to someone else in the room. So we need to take on board the different perspectives and the different research questions. We spoke about the transition. So for a new medicine to get to a patient, it needs to go through the regulator, the payer, the prescriber, and then the patient. Each one of those four people, have different requirements from their medicine. We spoke about vaccine and for the coronavirus questions that popped up. But we can predict pretty much what these questions can be. And we can understand that those research questions need to be understood right up front, so as early as possible. Now, if we take the research questions and generate that scientific knowledge, it becomes evidence. Okay, those sequence of events need to be understood before we get to the evidence stage. Now, when we look about how we do it, it has to be outside a clinical trial, because we all know that a selected population doesn't really work for anyone else other than the regulator. And Alex has quite rightly pointed out that we're never going to replace a clinical trial for the regulator. What RWE does do for the regulator is that if we provide RWE alongside a clinical trial, we provide the regulator with a broader population in which there is an experience of this new medicine. And we know that that is more likely to expand the indicated population that the regulator will grant that medicine to be used in. And that's really important. The regulators are keen to enable these medicines to be used in as broad a population as possible. They just need to have the reason to believe. Unless we provide that reason to believe, it's not going to happen. So we shouldn't really be unhappy that the regulators are just providing the narrowest population, because that's all that we're giving to them to understand. So RWE for the regulator is specific in that the broader population we provide to the regulator, the greater likelihood of a greater population being provided. What does that mean to the layperson? It means more patients will receive the benefit of new medicine if we get RWE alongside RCTE to the regulator. If we move to the payer, I don't want to repeat a lot of the good work that's already been spoken about the payers, but we know that they need burden of disease, they need cost effectiveness, they need healthcare utilization, quality of life. All of those things need to happen for the payer. If I skip over those, and being a medic myself, a doctor, and having prescribed, looked after rare disease patients, if I look at what would make me write a prescription for a new medicine, a lot of my research questions may not be what the payer wants or even the regulator wants. I want to know what subgroups would work. Can I use it with this combination of medicines? What about this patient here that wouldn't make it into a clinical trial? So my requirements for RWE are really quite specific to me in order for me to write the prescription. And what that means is that I'm the last person to, the last barrier between that new medicine going into the patient receiving the benefit of that medicine. If we can get all of those three stakeholders aligned and get that collaboration sort of working in our favor, we can get all those research questions gathered at one point in time, bring it back to the phase 2, phase 3 junction, okay? Implement our RWE protocols, our patient registries at that stage. We have all of those research questions answered at the point of regulatory approval. That means we can speed up the time to adoption. That means we know that some rare disease patients deteriorate in as short as 3 months. Gosh. So speed is of the essence here.
And you say if that could all be aligned, that might be a big if. Alexander, can I put that word back to you? What about striking the balance there that Ravi has described and touched on Christina's points, trying to get that balance between the scientific rigor, ensuring the patient's safety, and yet not delaying access to medicines, particularly in rare diseases, where, as you're saying, they can deteriorate so quickly. How does that balance get achieved?
Yeah, first of all, I would completely agree with Ravi. It's really also very important to take the physician's perspective into consideration. What he's just describing is equally important as everything that I talked about before. It is really important that physicians figure out which product does a product work in a certain subpopulation, and so on and so forth. So it's a very important point here. Yeah, how to strike the balance? I think actually real-world evidence and real-world data cannot immediately answer all our questions, but it's a way forward to find answers also for reimbursement decision makers. And I think that it always depends on what question you're asking. I remember a discussion in GBA where they started to set up registries. It's a German HTA agency, GBA. They started to do that like 3-4 years ago. And they started in a situation where they had three products to choose from in SMA, spinal muscular atrophy. And they said, well, actually, there's no data comparing the three directly against each other. So we don't know what is better in what type of situation. And they've been asking very concrete questions to say, yes, I'm saying yes to all three of them for reimbursement, but I do want to know more about the interaction between the three. What works better in what type of patient population? And of course, they also have a background of safeguarding budget. If the cheaper one is equally good as the more expensive one, they would probably turn to the cheaper one. So there is an element of cost containment in there, which is okay, which is understandable. We need to safeguard our healthcare budgets. But there's also that element of the clinician to know better, and that's probably the even more important element here, to know better what product performs in which type of patient population and duration of effect and so on and so forth. I think that's really critical. So you can strike the balance to your question, Sue. You can strike the balance, I think, between the different objectives of questions you're asking and the different purpose of real-world evidence. Now, I again want to make sure that real-world evidence cannot immediately answer any questions, so it's not a magic tool. But I think it has a great potential if we're asking the right questions to fill gaps and to make sure that there is a better understanding about innovation and new technologies. Also, by the way, in medical devices where there is a lot happening as well.
Thank you. And Christina, with the European Commission role that you have, trying to translate all of this into legislation. What do you think that member states could do at a national level, or perhaps that the EU should be doing more on a regional level, whether that's funding? What would you like to see for the better uptake of real-world evidence?
So, this is a very challenging question, and I will talk only from the research and innovation perspective. So this means what research can contribute, because this is the challenge. It's not only research; it's about how our innovation ecosystem works, how we take the results of the basic research faster to the exploitation or how we integrate all the knowledge that we have to use it to design faster therapies also. So what I can say from the research European Union perspective, from the research perspective, what we are trying, and this is one angle of the situation, it is we are working very much since 2004, 2006 back with the member states to coordinate and align the research policies in order to mobilize more budget, more targeted research challenges to be addressed with research and innovation. And this is now, I don't know if you have heard in the Horizon Europe, the framework program for research and innovation that started in 2021, we are planning to have a big European partnership on rare diseases. And actually, this does not build from scratch. We have a history of aligning and working with the member states, with the European Joint Programming of Rare Disease, the European reference networks that are integrated, several innovators, small and medium enterprises, and basic researchers also building the appropriate animal models or appropriate disease models to be able to study, to be able to identify appropriate targets for rare diseases. And we are trying to create this kind of environment, research and innovation ecosystem. It's a very popular word, with all the stakeholders together, driven by the member states, but in order to be able to address the challenges. Because I just want to say that in the last 15, 20 years, only at the European Union level, we have invested 2.4 billion more to 400 collaborative networks, means the European model, the multidisciplinary model of collaboration. And still, now, 95% of the rare diseases, they lack approved therapies. So the challenge and the heterogeneity and the complexity, it is this higher scale. So for me, one needs to integrate not only real-world evidence that's coming, but all type of data, all knowledge together in an integrative manner to be able to identify faster and develop better the existing clinical therapies that are in the pipeline also.
Thank you. And you touched on AI. I'm not going to name any names of any AI programs that might be in the news, but perhaps that could help. There's so much to pack in this morning and time is tight. I want to be able to take questions from the floor because you, the audience, have the most amazing panel here, and it's your opportunity to put your questions to them. If you'd like to put a question to our panel, please raise your hands. Lady over here, could you put your microphone on and put your question, say who you are, please?
Thank you again for this very interesting seminars. I'm Stella Veliki. I have studied physics and informatics, and I'm a member of the European Physical Society. And I have a question for Mr. Nuts concerning the European health data space. I didn't answer very well how is the architecture of this database. And secondly, how do you use this database? I am a patient with rare diseases. I'm going from Belgium to another European country. I have my ID and my password, and I give to the medicine. So you have this, you can contact to this European health, and how you use it, or you don't have it now.
Yeah, thank you for that question. You're asking a very important question. I mean, when we're creating a European health data space, which I think is a very important endeavor, and it's really important that we are making sure that the data can be seen by the physician in other countries as well. Of course, there are details which we need to fine-tune. We have heard about opt-in and opt-out and patients' rights and who gets first access to the data and who controls the data. Very important questions in terms of data protection, especially from the patient perspective. So I think the patient perspective should be critical in all those discussions. Let me first of all make that comment. But at the end of the day, I think it's good that we're having a discussion here, that we have a proposal from the Commission on the table, which we're discussing in the European Parliament about how can we make data interoperable, how can we reuse data, not to ask the same question again at the member state level, to meet different objectives and to answer actually the same question with a new data set. That doesn't make any sense. So I think in that sense, it makes absolute sense to have that discussion. We are grateful that also we have to see that discussion from the perspective of the competitiveness of the industry. I think that's really important. We are not living in our little bubble in Europe here. We have competition and research from other parts of the world. But to your point, when we're creating that data space, we need to make sure that we're not falling short of the patient's need in terms of getting reimbursement when also going to other countries. And I think that's really the most important question. What is it worse if the physician in another country can access the data from my home country where I'm insured, but cannot prescribe me that medicine? That doesn't make any sense at the end of the day. So we need to also work, and we've been, as a trade organization, together with other partners and stakeholders, we've been putting forward the request that we need to look at the cross-border healthcare legislation in Europe, which is patients' rights legislation, to make sure that patients can get actually reimbursement when they travel to other countries. That seems to be working for minor things like little surgeries. When I get my teeth done in another country, I get what my German reimbursement system would pay me for it. I get that money back from my German reimbursement system. But it doesn't work when it comes to real severe diseases, when it comes to gene therapies, where there's a lack of expertise in terms of those disease areas and those technologies. It's not really working, because there the healthcare systems are very often saying no to reimbursement if it's not done in their home country. So we need to work with that. There is definitely an angle here in Brussels, because we have legislation, we have a regulation, and we have a directive to look at into cross-border healthcare. And I really would like to ask you for thank you for that question, because it's about the health data space, but it's also about actually making it possible to get prescriptions done over into other countries and get reimbursement there.
Thank you very much. And I know we're already running over. I want to put to Ravi something. It's my job to stir things a little bit here. Ravi, I know that you have in the past said that in terms of collecting real-world evidence, getting the data to provide the evidence, pharmaceutical industry itself might not be doing enough. Now, Alexander represents some of the smaller companies. We might be represented here by some of the larger companies. We've touched on the global, access to global information. It's a global world now. What more should industry be doing in order to help provide this information?
As we touched on earlier, we need to start these RWE programs at phase 2, phase 3. Okay, if I can go to a register of... Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
Gosh, that was... okay, right, let me start again now.
That was a rehearsal.
I know. We need to essentially do what we say we're going to do on the tin. Okay, we need to get pharma companies to design and implement their real-world evidence strategies, their patient registries at phase 2, phase 3. And only then can we say that RWE is working for us. Now, if I was going to go to the EMA register of orphan drugs and look at those drugs and research them on clinicaltrials.gov, how many of those drugs do you think I'd see with RWE programs? Not very many. Okay, so that's the first thing. You know, it needs to be incumbent. It's incumbent upon the pharma companies who have the resources, who have the interest, okay, to be truly patient-centric. And we're going to use the patient-centric word here. If you're truly interested in getting more patients on new medicines sooner, RWE is going to do that for you. That means we need to take it seriously, implement it at phase 2, phase 3, and crucially use instruments to observe patients in the correct way. So not just pick a liver enzyme that works for a regulator that has no value to anybody else, but to look at the full, we call it the disease phenotype for a patient with a rare disease. So all the observable characteristics of a patient with a disease, not just one or two, because the more likely, the more of that disease phenotype we observe in RWE, the greater likelihood we have of detecting benefits of these new medicines. It's so often the case that we see the wrong instruments used and we miss the benefit. And that's quite damaging. So what can we do? We can go to each and every pharma company that has a rare disease medicine in the pipeline at phase 2, phase 3 and say, where's your RWE?
Okay, excellent. Well, there's the challenge to the industries. There's so many more questions, and I do hope that our panel will stay with us for our very early lunch at 11, because if there's an opportunity to mingle and ask more questions, that would be absolutely marvellous. We're going to have to park that one there for now, but please join me now in thanking this panel on rare diseases. Thank you all. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to invite them to leave the stage while I invite up our next group. We are now going to be discussing influenza in the light of real-world evidence. And this, of course, is a topic where it affects a huge number of people rather than the rare disease populations. So the randomized control clinical trials have a role, but what about real-world evidence? I'd like to invite up to talk about this Dr. Daniel Furtner, who is the medical director and of vaccines and biosecurity at CSL Seqirus. And Dr. Furtner is going to talk to us about the role of RWD, the data, in policy and regulatory decision-making for vaccines. And after Dr. Furtner's presentation, we will discuss the implications in influenza. So welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, MEP Stelios Kimbouropoulos, and of course also MEP Tomislav Sokol. You too, thanks for chairing. My name is Daniel Furtner. I work for CSL Seqirus. CSL stands for Commonwealth Serum Laboratories, and that's an Australian company that produces flu vaccines since 1916. And today I want to talk a little bit about the importance of real-world evidence for flu vaccine effectiveness assessment. If we go to the next slide, please. A recent study on the burden of communicable diseases in Europe looked at diseaseability adjusted life years for overall 31 selected diseases, and it showed that influenza, flu, has the highest burden. In fact, it's 30% of the total burden. And that's followed by tuberculosis, HIV, AIDS, or invasive pneumococcal disease. So you see the red dot on the upper right corner where you have the highest incidence and the highest mortality. So there's a considerable burden of flu in Europe. I also want to point out that flu is seasonal, and seasonal influenza is therefore a major cause of illness and the burden to the healthcare systems. If we go to the next slide, let's take a moment to look at the influenza virus in the context of other pathogens that cause disease. Such pathogens like diphtheria, tetanus, polio, measles, mumps, rubella. They're very stable and they don't mutate that often over time. And we've been relatively successful from an R&D perspective and a manufacturer perspective to develop vaccines against these diseases, which you see in the chart on the left. Pneumococcus and meningococcus are also relatively stable, against which we have been also successful in developing reliable vaccines. But on the other end of the spectrum, we have the influenza virus and the human immunodeficiency virus, HIV, which are highly variable and they're constantly evolving. it's much harder to create vaccines against viruses that evolve so quickly. And the influenza virus is one of the most variable pathogens against we currently immunize. And that said, its perpetual evolution necessitates a half-yearly review of the 4 strains chosen to be put into the vaccine formulation. If we go to the next slide. As such, every year the flu vaccine varies in its effectiveness because the virus mutates so rapidly. As strains of the influenza virus change, so need vaccines reformulation. So influenza virus in that sense is unique, and the effectiveness of flu vaccination is effectively a product of the characteristics and strains included in the vaccine, as well as the match between the virus and the circulating strains in the population, for which we measure vaccine effectiveness. So influenza viruses are constantly changing due to different types of mutations in the viral genes, and that results in altered surface glycoproteins, neuraminidase, hemagglutinin. I don't want to go too much into details, but it enables the virus essentially to escape the antigen-specific immunity that is induced by prior infection, so you either had already disease, or by immunization. Also, there is antigenic shift. It's a genetic reassortment and the consequent emergence of a novel virus subtype, or a clade. We have seen that with COVID, for example, as well. So that antigenic evolution and the regional variations require that the antigen composition of a flu vaccine has to be changed and adapted annually. There are also other variables that impact the seasonal flu vaccine effectiveness. It can be the vaccine itself. If we produce flu vaccines in chicken eggs, so egg-based manufacturing, there's a phenomenon that's called egg adaptation that can occur and that can lead to potential strain mismatch, making the vaccine less effective. It can also be the host itself. Patients can be immunocompromised, or the elderly can have a phenomenon called immunosenescence, where there's a decline in the immune responses. So the question for us, of course, here is, how can we reasonably accomplish to account for these factors, but also achieve a robust vaccine effectiveness estimation? We want to know how well the vaccine works. Next slide shows you that assessing vaccine outcomes can be done with randomized controlled trials and real-world evidence. And we have to acknowledge that randomized controlled trials are essential. They are basically the foundation for a registration. They establish the safety and efficacy, but they do it under controlled circumstances. And that means there is a protocol that defines a relatively narrow population with stringent inclusion and exclusion criteria. It also defines the period of time, the assessments, and the duration of a study. And that means the results from randomized controlled trials, because of the nature, how they are designed, make the data less generalizable. On the other hand, with real-world evidence, we look into a general or more representation of the patient population. And that's quite important, because real-world evidence can produce a range of responses with results that are more generalizable, that are applicable to every one of us, different groups. And if we look at the image on the right, it just shows you that the amount of data over time, and we see with randomized controlled trials in gray, it's just a small amount of data and a limited duration. Whereas with real-world evidence, we have that large amount of data generated over a longer period of time. And if we look at the next slide, the evidence generated by randomized controlled trials may not necessarily and truly represent patient outcomes in the real world. And that's particularly also relevant for the changing nature of the influenza virus. And we have to acknowledge, and I think everyone has heard it before, but randomized controlled trials, they include highly selected participants. So it's a narrow population, controlled conditions, and a limited duration. The advantage here is there's a higher internal validity. On the other hand, real-world evidence has a heterogeneous population. It is applied in routine practice conditions and settings, and it reflects basically diverse patient backgrounds. And thereby, there's a higher external generalizability. Now, let's look at those two pictures. And when I thought about how to depict that, I said, well, if you drive on a freeway with your car, randomized controlled trials would be just driving on one lane in one direction. There's not that many other participants, and it's quite controlled conditions. Whereas if I have real-world evidence and put the analogy to the same driving a car, you would rather drive somewhere on a country road with a lot more participants, different directions, different additional factors, traffic conditions, and so on. So it's important also to keep that in mind. The next slide is raising the point, why do we actually need real-world evidence in flu? And first and foremost, with real-world evidence, we can assess flu vaccine effectiveness. The efficacy and safety is already established for randomized controlled trials, but the effectiveness is the most crucial thing. And we can do that, and that's also an important factor with the influenza virus. We can do that over consecutive or sequential seasons. It wouldn't make sense to have the same vaccine and do that over different seasons because the virus has already changed. So we need real-world evidence to really show us how effective the vaccine is. It reflects basically the real extent to which vaccines reduce the burden of disease at the population level over time. Also, real-world evidence generate estimates using relevant patient-oriented outcomes. And I think that's quite an important point because it has to be relevant. And as we've heard before, it has to be relevant for regulators, reimbursement bodies, decision makers, also national immunization technical advisory groups. And with real-world evidence, we can look into numbers of cases, medical visits, hospitalizations, death, and other outcomes that are more patient-centric. It demonstrates also whether interventions provide benefits to patients and essentially improve public health. And real-world evidence also allows here to assess more varied and larger recipient populations in different locations with different levels of risk of infection, for example. Also, it can be different levels of infectiousness or susceptibility to get infected, or the duration as well as population compliance and hesitancy. We've been quite familiar with that topic through the pandemic here as well. So it provides essentially a valid support tool for health decision makers. And also the data are generated essentially from various sources. It can be patient charts, it can be patient records, electronic or medical records, but it can be disease registries, and also patient-generated data. In that health tech space, there is wearable devices, for example, that also can generate meaningful data depending on the question we ask. Yet we have to keep in mind that the assessment tools in flu vaccine that are used by national immunization technical advisory groups may not sufficiently take into account real-world evidence on responses to seasonal immunization. We think that real-world evidence is likely undermined by common approaches such as GRADE, which stands for Grading of Recommendations, Assessment, Development, and Evaluation. It's a very common assessment tool, and it's usually applied for all sorts of recommendations. But it tends to rank evidence from randomized control trials higher. And there are actually also good alternatives to GRADE. For example, Robin's Eye, which looks into non-randomized data generated and levels it out. So this should be considered. GRADE, in fact, should not be considered as an extensive metric to support vaccination policy, because it leaves the real-world evidence and the seasonal aspect and the high mutant frequency of the influenza virus out to some degree. So next slide in summary. As mentioned before, seasonal influenza, seasonal flu, is a major cause of illness. It's associated with substantial health and economic burden, primarily due to the impact on healthcare, but also on a societal level. The influenza virus is highly variable and constantly evolving, and it makes it a unique challenge to manufacture, to create vaccines. The influenza virus is one of the most variable pathogens against which we're currently able to immunize, but flu vaccine manufacturing is quite a complex process, and it takes also some time because there's also an opportunity for change to occur between selected strains and the wild-type strains that are in circulation. So there's an opportunity for mismatch to some degree. So the appropriate evaluation of flu vaccines based on epidemiological and economic data is of utmost importance for accurately informing policymakers primarily, and also allocating resources for seasonal flu vaccination programs. Real-world evidence is particularly important for influenza vaccines due to the variability of the flu season, occasional mismatch between circulating virus strains and those that the vaccine target, and also the difficulty to generalize findings from 1 or 2 seasons. We have to acknowledge that randomized controlled trials are the gold standard for regulatory purposes, but they represent a small subset of the available data on flu vaccines. It's not particularly useful to run multi-year randomized controlled trials with each year's seasonal flu vaccine. You would not get the data that measure the effectiveness and wouldn't make much sense. So a holistic understanding of the effectiveness of the impact and safety of flu vaccines requires a balanced approach, considering the full evidence base of RCDs and real-world evidence, and recognizing the strengths and weaknesses of the associated data. The systemic use of real-world evidence can deepen our understanding of medicine, and that includes vaccines, enhance policy decisions, and facilitate the access to European citizens to effective medicines. And that also includes vaccines. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Daniel Furtner. I'd like to now invite Professor Katarina Rizzo to join us up here to discuss some of these points with reference to influenza immunization. Professor Rizzo is a full professor of hygiene and preventive medicine at the University of Pisa. And it would be lovely to pick up on some of those points that Daniel was making there. Once, from your own perspective, Katarina, the points that Daniel made about the value of real-world evidence in public health, he touched on these technical advisory groups. How does that work, do you see, across Europe? Are they beautifully harmonized? Is everybody taking the same value judgments on this? As a professor with a nice overview across Europe, how do you see this bedding in?
Thank you, Sue. First of all, thank you all, and thank you in particular to Mr. Kimpouropoulos for organizing this meeting. We all see the value, and I see a lot of cross-setting edge in different perspectives of what we have heard and what we will learn in the next session. Regarding your specific question, of course, there's a lot of work to do in order to try to harmonize this committee at the European level. Of course, real-world evidence data in vaccines are crucial since, let's say, most of the vaccines that are administered in the population are within the national immunization plan, so are within, are paid by our taxes as citizens. And it's relevant for the population and for the government and in general for the public health to have information on the vaccine program that we implement, and in particular for vaccine influenza. It's important to also point out there are different vaccines available with different brands. They are very, very different one from the other. And with specificity regarding and specific characteristics in different population, and because we know there are different population and different recommendation at the European level, of course, but influenza vaccines is mostly recommended in at-risk population and over 60, over 65, depending on the country, because there are still some differences also in the target population for vaccine. Also at-risk population as pregnant women, as at-risk individuals in general for comorbidities. And having in mind that since these vaccines, this kind of vaccine are administered within the public health framework, is important for government and for public health officers to have an overview on how their program works. And the only way is to use real-world evidence data in order to estimate vaccine effectiveness. Another important aspect, very important aspect, is that for EMA, the European Medicines Agency, they recently changed some years ago, very few years ago in 2017, their guidelines for the authorization of commercialization of influenza vaccine in particular. And in those guidelines is clearly stated that for every year authorization, the industries need to present vaccine effectiveness data. So no data from the clinical trial, randomized clinical trial, but data from the real world evidence. So it's a contrasting way in which, we are, we are in a situation in which data are there, data are in the public health system, but we cannot access to the data because, but the regulatory agency are asking for the data for authorizing the vaccines. And so the risk is that the industries will go to other countries in doing that kind of data, real-world evidence, to collect the real-world evidence data for the European authorization. And this is, a nonsense in some way.
What would you like to see the regulators, the legislators then at this stage put in place? Maybe there are some best practices you could call on, or are there any specific things that you think would overcome that?
Of course, let's say that one of the best opportunity is, of course, to try to harmonize this information and to in some way try to find the way to harmonize the data collection and to pool the data and to make it available for the sake of public health and also for private companies that are interested, of course, anonymized and everything that we have already said. But another important aspect, in my opinion, is also the way in which vaccines are, within the committee, are introduced in a national immunization plan or are introduced in the recommendation of the single countries. Daniel touched the point about the grade, so the framework that this committee uses for deciding how, to introduce a vaccine and how relevant it is to introduce a vaccine. We know that this kind of framework is trying to do as objective as possible, but has some subjective decision included also. It is important and is based only on randomized clinical trial because the high evidence is given by the randomized clinical trial and they don't touch at all the real world evidence data. So it's important at this stage to try to harmonize. And what the ACP, so the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practice in the US has done, last year they decided to also decide to introduce the vaccine and the recommendation of the vaccine specific groups, target groups, not only using the grade, but also integrating the grade with a kind of framework of evidence recommendation in which a lot of experts were around the table and also analyzing data from real-world evidence, not only from the random clinical trial. This is something, in my opinion, that we should also start in doing.
And that's really interesting to see that. And before I go to questions from the audience, let's just bounce that quickly to Daniel. Is that something, that example from America, a different way of doing it, that you think should be done or that would help overcome some of the challenges that might be there in terms of actually using real-world evidence to get most effective assessment of vaccines? Is there something that, again, with the voice of the legislators or regulators, that you would like to see done, something to shift in the system?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. I think it's a very good point. I think there are two things that are important. First is the assessment of the evidence and taking real-world evidence more into account. We have to acknowledge that there are some risks of bias and missing data, and there's the heterogeneity. But particularly with flu, with the influenza virus being that mutagenic and changing, real-world evidence is the tool to tell us the vaccine effectiveness. So this is really important then that in the assessment, there are also other methodologies that consider real-world evidence and rank it higher as it is currently. And as mentioned, there's the Robbins I, for example, which is an assessment tool that could be complementary to GRADE. So it should be, I would say, a more holistic approach when it comes to real-world evidence and flu vaccine effectiveness. Now, the second point is timeliness. If I have a virus that changes on a seasonal basis, and I'm the manufacturer, I have to have a lead-in time to have the virus strains predicted and then manufacture the vaccine accordingly. So what I would expect from a National Immunization Technical Advisory Group to be timely in the recommendations, what vaccine should be used, and also to some degree individualize those recommendations, for example, to age groups or populations. And that can be done, and we see this in other countries. So we see that in the UK, we see that in the US, or we see that in Australia. I think it's an important point.
Thank you. Let's see if there are some questions from the audience here. Again, what a fantastic opportunity to put your questions to our experts here. Anything anybody would like to raise? Oh, you're all shy today. Gentleman over here, would you like to click your microphone on and say who you are, please?
Thank you for your presentations. My name is Demosthenes Panagiotakos. I'm from Greece. I'm professor of epidemiology and medical research methodology. Currently, I'm senior editor of Medical Research Methodology Journal, which runs a special issue on real-world data, real-world studies, and real-world evidence. So what we have heard in these two nicely presented sections is about real-world evidence. But to have evidence, we need studies. And from studies, we get data. So I would like just a comment for our audience here regarding the quality of the real-world data. For me, this is the most important, because in data science, they care about the quality. In medical science, we care a lot about the quality. And I'm afraid that there's no legislation till now regarding the quality of the data we have in our registries or whatever. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Katerina first and then Daniel.
Yes, thank you so much for your question, because it's very important and relevant to point out that for vaccine influenza effectiveness studies, there are specific guidelines licensed by the ECDC in order how to conduct methodological and ethical correctly studies on vaccine effectiveness on influenza. And there are guidelines on how to conduct case control test negative studies, cohort studies, and other real-world evidence data that is not the user.
Not talking about the formal studies, sorry.
No.
We're talking about the real-world data.
No, but the real-world data are collected within, let's say that from the real-world evidence data, yes, we can use the data
systems
to
like
set up
Sentinel. Yes.
To set up screening method on other method that can be methodologically strong in order to build such results. In terms of, for example, we know that part of the population is vaccinated for influenza, for example, and part is not vaccinated. So we can compare the two groups in order to see the outcome and in order to optimize what is the limited resources that we have in terms of also economically expenditure. So real-world evidence data for vaccine effectiveness in particular would be very, very important, and also the methodology can be translated from real-world evidence into studies that can be, strong from a methodological point of view. Not, of course, there are some bias that you can have still, since you have to adjust for several information. So real-world evidence data should be also get information, a lot of information on comorbidities and other specific situations that can change and be in some ways bias your results. So you have to, of course, make all effort possible in order to collect as much as possible data. But I'm not aware about the quality because for vaccine, for example, the data are collected within different, from different perspective, and mainly of these data are within specific framework that are very well designed and are very complete. Think about the immunization registries. They are very good, in terms of quality and information collected and type of information collected. So.
Thank you, Katerina. And Daniel, briefly, if you would, what's your answer to that question?
Look, I think overarchingly, the quality of data is of utmost importance. And of course, real-world evidence is a solution that's not as perfect as randomized controlled trials in that sense. So you will always have some confounders, some risk of bias. But there are tools to eliminate that to some degree. You can do some sensitivity analysis from a statistical viewpoint, but you can also think about how you design the real-world evidence data collection. If I do it in a prospective way, in a homogeneous population, if I look at influenza seasons, not just one, but 2 or even 3 in the same population, if I have a large sample size, these would all be factors contributing to make the data higher quality and more valid. So, and there are some frameworks and some guidance to how to improve the quality of real-world evidence.
Thank you. This sounds like the start of a discussion. I hope you might all be able to network after this session to take that on. So much more to say, but please join me for now in thanking our panel on influenza. Thank you both. And now to our final disease area, oncology or cancer, to discuss the value of real-world evidence. I'd like to welcome Antonella Cardoni, who is the CEO of Cancer Patients Europe, to tell us all about how the EU legislation might be able to help improve access and indeed the use of real-world data that might benefit outcomes for cancer patients. Antonella, your name badge has miraculously appeared. Welcome, and over to you, please.
So thank you. I would like to thank specifically MEP Kimpouropoulos, not only for today's event, but for the long marathon of 3 days of activities. And all in all, what he's doing is all for the benefit of the patients. So I'm really grateful and thankful for this big and huge effort. So thank you. And of course, I also thank MEP Sokol for co-hosting this roundtable discussion. A lot has already been said on real-world data and evidence, but I want to stress specifically that real-world data and real-world evidence play a fundamental role in the development of personalized cancer care, can support regulatory approval decisions for new life-saving treatments, help payers to determine the value of new cancer treatments, and inform clinical decisions of healthcare professionals. So the question is how? How can real-world evidence, which is the clinical evidence of the effectiveness, impact, and safety of a treatment based on the analysis of real-world data, contribute to the development of cancer treatments? I think that it's worth to start with the limitation of the current system. We already heard something about it. So traditionally, the safety and effectiveness of new treatments are assessed through the analysis of data from prospective randomized controlled clinical trials, which I would have loved to be able to say was, so use the past sense. But I unfortunately I still have to say is considered the gold standard to demonstrate the safety and efficacy of a new treatment. But the data collected within a clinical trial where the study is designed to control the variability in ways that are representative of real-world care and outcomes presents many limitations. For example, traditional clinical trials have strict inclusion criteria that make it challenging to extrapolate the results of a clinical trial to a broader population. And this is a limitation that has an impact, especially on rare cancers or rare diseases in general, and of course, pediatric cancers. Another limitation is based on the fact that clinical trial participation is often limited by who is implementing the study, ability to recruit the patients. And this tended to exclude various demographics. For instance, people living in rural areas, or in the case of Italy, for instance, people living in the south versus people living in the north. And this again challenges the generalizability of clinical trial results across patient population. So there is a clear need for complementary, if not alternative approaches to clinical trials, and the need to increase the flexibility of trial design and the statistical analysis. So on one side, we have the need to find complementary or alternative approaches to clinical trials, and on the other side, we have real-world evidence that provides a clinical reach insightful into what actually happens in everyday practice and why it happens. So it provides new knowledge to support decision-making and improves safety and effectiveness and ultimately patient outcomes. So real-world data is any data that is collected in the context of routine delivery of care. Real-world data captures what actually happens before, during, and after clinical procedures, interventions, and visits to the doctor. And the real-world evidence tells us what really happens when doctors treat a wider range of patients that don't look like the homogeneous patient group in a clinical trial. And real-world evidence can help overcome the limitations of the clinical trial by providing information about a broader cross-section of the society. Also, during clinical trials, real-world evidence can supplement traditional outcome measurements with patient-generated data, such as patient-reported outcomes, or biometric data that is easier to collect between doctors' appointments. So having said that, this is a timely discussion to be having at this moment in time, as the legislative framework is shaping now in Europe across the European health data space, the pharmaceutical package, and also the UHTA regulation. So we are happy that the European health data space is considering real-world evidence, and there is an ongoing debate about the digitalization of healthcare. We hope that the pharma package will properly address the relevance of complementing clinical data with the real-world data. And especially this is valid for cancers with a small population such as pediatric cancer and rare cancers. And in the context of the definition of unmet medical needs. So we should also look at how best to collect real-world data and ensure that it is integrated into the regulatory and HTA processes. One of the key concerns is how data is collected, the quality of data that we heard before is used, and impactful, how impactful it can be. So to this extent, for patients, what is very important is the consent from the patients. So the consent is key, as we need to know, for instance, who is sponsoring a specific study, where the data will be collected and how. Furthermore, the patient needs to know who will be using the data, for which purpose and how. The patient should be in as much as possible control of the data, and we heard MEP Sokol speaking about the opt-out system. And the opt-out system is crucial for us, for patients. To this extent, though, we do understand the risk of jeopardizing the study if we opt out without irrational, and which we want to avoid. Because, I mean, of course, studies are meant to benefit patients, to be beneficial to patients. So we need to find a responsible way to opt out. Another fundamental point for patients and real-world evidence is that we need to develop and consolidate a trust between all the different stakeholders involved in the process. Currently, I can say that we are on the right track, also in Europe. We see advances in the availability of real-world data sources, such as electronic health records, registries, medical claims, pharmacy data, and feedback from wearables and mobile technology, which increase the potential to generate robust real-world evidence. So to conclude, the real-life clinical performance of a treatment might be more clearly demonstrated through real-world data and real-world evidence, because a controlled clinical trial often cannot evaluate all the benefits and risks of treatment in clinical practice across the full range of potential users, and real-world data can add value at every stage of the drug development life cycle. And I stop here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much for your presentation there. Thank you. And I am delighted to welcome, on my left, on your right, we have Fulvio Raffaelli, who is the head of unit DG Santé C1 at the European Commission. Welcome. And coming to the stage now, we have Professor Panos Bamidis, you did say I could call you Panos, Professor of Medical Physics, Informatics and Medical Education, and also Director at the Laboratory of Medical Physics and Digital Innovation at the School of Medicine at the Aristotle University of Thessalonica. That's a lot of titles, a lot there. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Fulvio, if I could put it to you, you've been very involved in proposing and drafting the European health data space. How could that help in terms of the uptake of real-world data evidence that will then help in the development and assessment of medicines for Europe?
Short question, yes. short reply is yes. I think a lot has been said today about the benefits that could result actually from more availability of real-world evidence and data. So I'm not going, of course, to elaborate on that, but what I want to do, really to make it clear is the health data space that we are designing on, we're discussing with the co-legislator, as really the ambitions of getting this data available for the researchers, the innovators, and the policy deciders of tomorrow. Those data are available today at a very local basis because, of course, in most of the cases, these data are collected for primary care. I mean, either for therapy, for diagnosis, for prevention. So these data are available already. They are already collected through many different sources, being the hospitals themselves, being the registries that have been mentioned before. In many ways, these data are available, actually are recorded, but not necessarily available for the researchers, the innovator of today. So the ambition of the health data space is really to create the conditions for those data to become readily available under fair conditions and ensuring a super high level of protection for the privacy of those very important data. So the idea is to first of all to make let's say to create the condition for this data to be known. So the different organizations, sessions, healthcare professional systems that do have healthcare, electronic health data in their possessions will have, by the time, of course, made those data known and then collected at the European level and made available in the European catalogs of data. And where you could also find, let's say, identified also what the quality of the data is. And then I'm coming back to the previous question. So when making known the source of data, the data holders would also need to somehow identify the characteristics of the data they hold. And then actually once the innovator or the researchers of today will have identified, yes, I need that data sources. There is a full actually procedures that goes from the data user to identify what are the purposes which are allowed under the European data space, and what are the conditions actually to get to this data in terms of anonymization or in terms of securing process environment to get hold of this data, and then what are the information that they would need to give back actually in the system resulting from the study they're going to run on the basis of this data. Actually also providing elements for the discussions around the reimbursement, which of course remains very clearly in the hands of the member states, but to which the information about where and which data have been used could also contribute. So I think it's really a milestone. Is something that could change the work and the conditions actually for the researchers, the innovators of using those data tomorrow, and on making the data really a value, a benefit for our societal long-term objectives. Because these data are the ones that we can use, and we've heard, I mean, from the experts around the table that can really improve the databases on which you're going to design the therapies and the medicines, treatments of tomorrow.
Thank you.
Sorry, just yes, one word more. I think what I wanted to say is that this is particularly relevant, of course, for rare disease or rare cancer, where the numbers are very small. So the more we can pull together data and cross-references data, the more we could look at getting advantages and really benefits for those categories of patients. So.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt you there, but I think because you made so many important points, and it really struck me where you said that the data's recorded but not available. And Professor Panos Maimidis, I wonder if what sort of infrastructure is needed. I'm thinking there's a lovely example in the UK, dare I say, where there's an island off Scotland where they looked at the data and they realised that the gene pool there was a particular predominance of people who were susceptible to ovarian and breast cancer, and they tracked everybody through that. I was doing another event with a cardiologist who had access to all the epidemiological data anonymised from the NHS in Scotland, and in his study of troponin levels in the blood for a heart attack, he had access to everything. He said he had 100 centenarians, 100-year-olds in his study because he had access to the anonymized data through our particular system. So what, Panos, is needed in terms of infrastructure at member state level, at EU level, to do what Fulvia is trying to do in terms of giving access, to make that data available?
I think there's a lot to be done in terms of what is needed, and I would put a kind of two things. So basically, we have registries, but we don't have a lot of other data that they are not existing in the registries yet. And some of these real-world data are those that what we call it was mentioned earlier on as biometric data during the interactions with the health system or the doctor. We miss what used to be called lifestyle data, but they refer to interventions, they refer to therapies, they refer to specific interactions and points in our life. And those data are probably wild data, as I would call them. They are not of high quality because they are, by definition, they are left to the patients and the citizens on their own, and they are not collected by the health systems. They are probably connected by third parties, probably, but they are not available to the health system per se. So we need to change this infrastructure, make these data available, for example, for studies, anonymized, fully regulated, but to make them available in the health system. I think it needs to, it's a different part of what we call the medical record in the hospital, but it's a part of what we call the health record of a citizen. And that is not there yet, but it's being collected already in the last few years.
And is it a culture change that's needed then?
It's a culture change that's needed, because if you consider, if you ask the question, I want to put a device on you and monitor you, everybody will say no, I don't want it. But they are doing it already with the mobile phones. It's a question if I put something else, which will probably put a higher quality to my study and study better your condition. And there you need to convince them. But there is a different level of convincing them and getting them to be your own collaborators. That's what I wanted, where I wanted to put a distinction. You can have patients and citizens participating and perhaps engaged in the results and the awareness raising of your research, but it's a different thing altogether to get them involved. And this is what we should be aiming altogether.
Well, let's ask the patients then. Antonella, if you like to flick your microphone on, are you ready to do what the professor's suggesting? Get involved, be active, be engaged, co-create and co-design the real-world data to produce the evidence?
Yeah, I believe that patients, patients before being patients are citizens. And as it was said, citizens are already used to get their data collected via our laptop, our phone, our watch. So, there, in principle, there is no resistance if the patients are involved in the study from the beginning, because patients need to understand what their role is in collecting the data. So they need to become a sort of a partner in the study development, from the design to the implementation and then the use of the data. They must be involved in all this process, and the most important thing is to consider the patients as partners rather than just the object of the study.
Thank you. I know that it's tight on time, and I'm not sure if we're going to get chucked out on the hour. So any questions from the audience to our expert speakers? Fantastic opportunity. Gentleman at the back there, if you kindly put your microphone on and say who you are.
Hello. Congratulations for this very interesting scientific event. My name is Aristomenes Siggelakis. I'm President-elect of the Council of European Chief Dental Officers and teaching dental public health and health policy in universities in Greece and Cyprus. So I would like to ask about the ethical implications of real-world data management. For example, as we know from the literature, many researchers are conducting research with the aim of commercializing the outcomes. Even if it is legal to use de-identified data, it is natural to suspect that there is a high probability of re-identification if it is exploited for commercial purposes. Therefore, the concerns of civic organizations should not be ignored. And also, I would like to say that these civic organizations have a negative view about linking personal health records from separate departments. They contend that the consent of the bereaved families is needed for attempts to combine electronic medical record data in each hospital with the death data of governments. My question is how the fears of patients for re-identification and unethical use of their sensitive personal data could be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you. Very briefly, if I may, because we're coming to the end of our session. But Fulvia, fears, addressing the fears and the ethical considerations. What can you put into the legislation?
Well, trust is key in the system, and it will be defining the future usefulness or not of the system. On this, we agree. What we have suggested, actually, is that we have a very strong safeguards for all citizens altogether. This is the approach. The first layer is that the default approach is that only anonymized data would be provided. Of course, as a result of the permit process I've just described before, the regulation foresees a very clear list of purposes for which the data can be used, and also a list of uses are prohibited in the term. So we have the two sides of the medals, and these are now at the discussion, in the middle of the discussion of the co-legislators. And these purposes will guide actually the national health data access bodies in actually defining yes or no there is a need, and yes or no this request is justified. In case we know that, of course, in many cases, anonymized data are not enough for going into the refined studies that were mentioned before. So we also foresee the possibility of going in pseudonymized data. But in this case, we are providing an additional layer of, let's say, safeguards in relation with the providing secure process environments where actually you could only bring your data, but then extracting only aggregated results and not raw data as such. Ethical considerations are key again, and would be the matter of the national data access bodies when going in their assessment of the request. So there are not only ethical, let's say, clear purposes which are foreseen in the regulation, but also additional national rules that would apply when looking at the permissions at the process.
Thank you. I'm going to have to cut you across there because I just want panels to have a very quick word. Do those reassurances satisfy you as the question was put?
I can probably take a more disruptive answer on that and reverse a little bit the question, in the sense that we do want the patients and the societies of patients to be involved, to be, co-designing, co-researching with us. And then at the end of the day, the projects from the European Commission, when they are funding, they want us to make business plans and exploit commercially. So the question was spot on there. So we never take into consideration why do we not commercialize with the patients in the game. So if a patient society is helping me do the research, why should a company X get the commercial rights? The patient society should be there, and the commercialization take some stake of that.
Thank you. I expect. Would you agree with that? Very briefly, Antonella. You want maybe you get paid for your data.
I mean, I don't, so I think that the benefit for the patients is there, it's obvious, so I don't think that we are necessarily looking for a monetary gain from the game. What is important to us is that any rules are strict, clear, and user-friendly, understandable to us, and not written in a jargon that we need a lawyer and a clinician to understand what is written there.
Bravo. Well, I'm sure everyone's listening. Thank you so much, panel. Again, so much to pack in. Thank you. Join me in thanking our panel. And for his final closing thoughts, I'd like to hand over to our host, MEP Stelios Kimbouropoulos, for your closing remarks, please, sir.
Yes, thank you very much. I think that every of its speech was, I think, focused really on the concerns, the desires, and the direction that we need to build in order to succeed on real world data and what is what we raised and we see and I believe that many of our dear extinguished speakers said, and that it's from little to very concrete, was that we need to call for the patients to bring their thoughts and to get involved on this process, because real world evidence can bring us a lot of experience, and which part of society has the biggest experience? I think people and citizens and patients. So we have this kind of in-depth discussion, and with this discussion before the lunch, we close this event, this 3-day event, in which we get many information that we can use in the upcoming files which are related to the health. And thank you very much, the speakers, because they have really very important contribution in different sectors. Yes, vaccines, yes, influenza, cancer, and rare disease are the most valuable aspects of the health that we can use as the primer in order, step by step, to build the really commanding and urgently frame for real world evidence. Because yes, everybody in this room is going to understand and to accept that evidence-based medicine is the gold standard of research, but we live in 2023, and we need to find and build another model of collecting data and creating policies. And this is something which is coming from real world, from what is happening today, now. Because if we see only with retrospective data, we're missing many information. So we need something which is coming from today's data. I think that this very fluent discussion from one topic to another, we had a chance to highlight the different needs and contribution. But what was most important today is that we raised awareness that we need more real-world evidence. We need accurate and safe data. And this is the time to collect them. There was a question raised many times today related to the legal framework covering real-world evidence. Today, I think is the opportunity to discuss, as at 10 a.m. this morning we had the deadline for tabling amendments in the report of European Parliament on υγείας, as we have heard from Tomislav Sokol. And I think that having this opportunity on creating this system is the first step in order to see, having this tool in our hands and using it properly, we can see and we can imagine that potential of this process are enormous, and is something that we are still don't know what can we lead us. So really thank you so much, all of you, being with us. Thank you to my staff. Again, I would like to name them. Vanessa Pentu, George Adorakakis, Adonis Koulianos, Michael Zassiris, and also Maiefi Konstantinou for their contribution. If these people weren't here, I think that it was not possible today to have such high level of discussions. And thank you that you support all the health issues, because I think that it's time to express and to create something that is in my very, very close to my heart, that we need to talk about health, respecting the rights of all stakeholders, respecting the rights of people, of patients, of industry, but also policy-making perspective, that everybody needs to put its concerns, its knowledge to this ongoing discussion and progress. Thank you so much.
Thank you to our host, MEP Stelios Kimbouropoulos. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you to all our fantastic speakers. I'm very conscious that you didn't have enough time to say all the things you want to say, and I hope you'll stay and network with everybody. Do scan those QR codes on the way out. Have a look at that call to action. Support it if you can. If you want to know more, get in touch with the organisers, because this is just the beginning. It's the launch today of the call to action, the beginning of a journey. And as Stelios was saying there, such an important journey to get that information. And as I think Antonella was saying, maybe the gold standard isn't going to be the past tense of the clinical trials. Maybe one day it'll be real world evidence that becomes the gold standard, but we may be away off that yet.
Sorry for the last word. And thank you very much too that you were here, and for your very active role, really, to gather the different questions, words, and beliefs on this very important issue. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It's been my great pleasure to be here with you all. Thank you. Early lunch on the 3rd floor. See you there. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd love to have a photo with you. Would that be rude? I don't know how to do this.